This is the fictional mindbender. Top Gun Maverick surpassed any and all expectations. And, as surprising as this was to many because it was a nostalgia flick with 80s callbacks, it also managed to connect with the audience on a personal level, as well as a theatrical level. One of the many questions people had when it came out, though, was who was Maverick going to fight? Because, just like in the first movie, he has to fight somebody. There were the obvious big three, of course, being Russia, China, and Iran, but instead, the movie chose to take a similar route to its predecessor. In 1985's Top Gun, the climax of the movie is a dogfight with a hostile nation's MiG-28 fighters, somewhere over the Pacific. Now, it has been said that the enemy was intended to be North Korea, and the emblems on the fighter certainly almost seem to suggest that. And this was as well as the fact that in real life, North Korea was a hostile nation at the time, so the Navy would naturally be flying combat scenarios that involved them. However, because America at the time was trying to improve relations with North Korea, it was decided by the studios to never name the nation specifically, nor replace it with another nation by name. Top Gun Maverick follows the same pattern, but I think for different reasons than its predecessor. And I also think that this played a big part in its global success as well. The first reason that the movie's enemy remains nameless is for, quite simply, deniability, along with implication. For example, while the nation is never named specifically, they are flying stealth fighters, Su-57s to be exact. And, like the nation flying them, they too are also not named specifically either, instead being called 5th generation fighters, which is true. But the fact that the Su-57 is a real plane and only flown by Russia provides enough implication without having to really say anything. Add to that the target was a nuclear enrichment plant tucked somewhere in a snowy and mountainous region. This implies that we're also possibly looking at Iran, given the long-standing issues that they've had with the global community over its nuclear enrichment program. And then finally, there's the fact that the enemy still has F-14s, by this time, as Richard says, being museum pieces. This too also implies Iran, since they are the only other nation besides the United States that has ever flown the F-14 Tomcat, and currently is the only known nation still flying them, since the Tomcat was retired from the US Navy about around 30 years ago. So, essentially, what the movie did was create an enemy nation that was an amalgamation of America's current adversaries by implication. It basically left us to fill in the blanks without having to say anything. And because it was an amalgamation, no one nation could clearly say publicly that America was targeting them specifically. So, how has this helped the movie become such a global success that it has been? Well, it first acknowledges the different landscape 2023 was from 1985. Famously, in the 80s, American culture overall had a devil-may-care attitude when it came to how to depict its enemies in public. If it was a special forces movie, your enemy was Arabic. Problem? Too bad. If it was a vintage war movie, your enemy was Vietnamese or German. Problem with it? Too bad. And so on. We were one of the two top dogs in the world, so the culture very much had a you can't tell us shit attitude towards any kind of positive or stereotypical representation that it did. Or at least anything short of outright birth of the nation level racism. And the first Top Gun movie very much rode that momentum and was why it was such a big success at that time. By Tom Cruise's own admission in an interview, it was a popcorn flick, not to be taken seriously, and it shows in the movies frat boys in the military like culture. To be sure, there were many people who did take issue with this, and other American movies that were as equally ethnocentric as well. And the world has had 40 years since then to evolve and change, with that resentment growing louder as time went on. Independence Day from the 90s is probably the best example I can think of, because it came at the very height of America's cultural influence in the world during that time, with the Soviet Union being vanquished at this time and China not really considered a global threat that we were about to go to war with. It's a plot of Earth being invaded by aliens and people having to unite to fight them off, which is arguably more positive, but one where it had the Americans taking the lead and everyone else just got a short cameo at the end, basically. And even then, those cameos were about praising the Americans for being the ones to crack the code of how to beat the aliens. And trust me, that did not go unnoticed. So, Top Gun Maverick's handling of its own Rogue Nation shows that it acknowledges this different era of cultural representation, and that American culture can no longer shove its way to the front of the line as a star anymore. And you can see this in the fighter pilot communities across the world. Even though it is an American film, many pilots appreciate how the film depicted more so the realities of being a modern fighter pilot without the overcast of politics that overshadowed its predecessor, thereby becoming more neutral in its stance, and for pilots of all nations and all branches to basically come together in a neutral place and appreciate it for what it was. And a faceless enemy pilot now didn't mean a dehumanization of a certain nation or peoples, but a blank slate that was left that way for the audience for themselves to, again, fill in the blank. Also, too, because of that neutral stance, there was no distraction from the story that the people who made the movie were trying to tell. Top Gun Maverick was easily accessible to everyone on a human level, no matter what military you're from or what your nationality was. And that is why this was just one of the many reasons Top Gun Maverick had become so legendary. But having said all that, tell me what you think below. But this is the Fictional Mindbender. You guys have a good day.